Hello, everyone. You are welcome to week 6 of our online facilitation. In this week 6, we are going to be discussing on industrial legislation, still on Module 3, titled Occupational Safety Requirements. Occupational safety requirements and industrial legislation, Unit 2, which is the last part of Module 3. What are the learning goals for this unit? At the end of this week's facilitation, learners are expected to understand and be able to explain the meaning of industrial legislation, understand the historical development of industrial legislation, especially in Nigeria, describe the types of industrial legislation, discuss the provision of factory acts and workmen's compensations laws, and lastly, learners are expected to be able to state the pertinent legislations. What is industrial legislation? It is a policy or rules approved by a government to guide working conditions by the aggregate of companies and enterprises in one or more manufacturing or technically productive fields. It means that legislation is a law set up to ensure that employers comply with the rules established to ensure safety of workers in any organization. Historical perspective for development of industrial legislation. Industrial legislation or rules or law developed as a burning desire to have full liberation of workers in industries that were used as slaves before the advent of industrial legislation. That is, before the era of industrial legislation was developed, workers were used as slaves. And so to abolish this, industrial legislation or law or policy needed to be put in place. And we understand that the oldest international body in modern times concerned with global health and safety of people at work is the International Labour Organization, known as ILO. This organization was founded in 1919 under the lead of nations. In Nigeria, public policy that effectively controlled occupational hazards was not enacted until 1960s. The main Safety and Health Act of 1968 was the first legislation that especially requires certain prevention programs for workers. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health was established by the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 and is a part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, known as CDC. What are the types of industrial legislations? There are three main types of industrial legislation, namely protective industrial legislation, labor relations legislation, collective agreements between unions and employers, protective industrial legislation. This type of law or policy deals with regulation of maximum hours of work and minimum wages for women and youths, regulate hazardous practices affecting employees, and also guarantee employees compensation for industrial accidents. The second type of legislation is labor relations legislation. Both the federal and the state labor relations laws guarantee a worker for free association in union. Labor legislation requires that employers and union bargain with each other. Both does not fix terms as in protective legislation. Collective agreements between unions and employers are developed to remedy abuses of workers and preserve peace. Functions of occupational safety and health are to determine and set standards for hazardous exposures in the workplace, to enforce the occupational health standards. These include the right of entry for inspection, to educate employers about occupational health and safety, to develop and maintain a database of work-related injuries, illnesses, and deaths. Lastly, to monitor compliance with occupational health and safety standards. The functions of National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health is as follows: to conduct research and review findings, and to recommend permissible exposure levels for occupational hazards to OSHA, to identify and research into occupational health and safety hazards, to educate about occupational health and safety, and lastly, to distribute research findings relevant to occupational health and safety. Purpose of legislation. The purpose of regulation is to reduce the number of job-related illness, injuries, and fatality of rate by requiring employers to establish a safety workplace and health program to ensure compliance with set standards by Occupational Safety and Health Administration Acts. Basic obligations. Each employer must set up a safety and health program to manage workplace safety and health, to reduce injuries, illness, and fatalities by systematically achieving compliance with occupational health and safety act standards. Basic obligation program are as follows: management, leadership, and employee participation, hazard identification and assessment, hazard prevention and control, information and training, evaluation of program effectiveness. Industrial legislation in Nigeria. Industrial legislation in Nigeria has taken place in two periods: pre-independence era under colonial administration and after independence. The most significant change was the coming into law of the Factory Act 1990 on account of the deficiency of the Factories Act of 1958. In 1990, the following areas were covered in the Factories Act: cleanliness, overcrowding, lights, drainage of floods, sanitary accommodations. Industrial Health and Welfare Center. Every industry, irrespective of its size, is required to provide a contiguous unit, if possible, an industrial health and welfare center. This should embody occupational health service units, toilet facilities, a restaurant, canteen or snack bar, and a resting room. Compensation Law of 1990. Employers' liability for compensation for death or incapacity resulting from accident that is not deliberate, which incapacitates the workers for a period of 3 consecutive days. Compensation in vital cases. This will be required to the sum of 42 months' earning, that is, 42 months' salaries. Compensation in cases of permanent total incapacity shall be equal to 42 months' salaries. Additional compensation of 1/4 of 44 months' salaries where an injury results in permanent total incapacity of such a nature that is, the injured workman must the constant help of another person. In other words, the need for additional 1/4 of the 42 months salary is required because this fellow has a permanent total incapacity, and as a result of that, the person will require an assistance that is helping the person, and this is why the additional compensation is required. Medical assessors is also required to be appointed for estimation of degree of disability. And lastly, compensation in case of temporal incapacity require full salary for first 6 months, half salary for first 3 months, and quarter of a salary for first 15 months. Legal protections in nursing practice. Laws and strategies are in place to protect the nurse or nurses against litigation. Good Samaritan Act protect the nurse or nurses when giving help in the scene of emergency. The Nurse Practice Act and Standards of Practice is a major legal safeguard for nurses. In conclusion, Unit 6 describes some of the legislations enacted to protect the health and safety of workers in occupational settings. Regulations relating to occupational health are necessary, concerning the fact that the goal of occupational health is to increase the span of the healthy life of working population by promoting the highest degree of physical, mental, and social well-being of workers. Regulations, therefore, is required to ensure implementation and enforcement in all industries. Thank you for listening.